Hello everybody, my name is Jesse Garcia, and today we're going to be going over the exposure triangle. It is a very foundation of everything that's photography. Now the exposure triangle really is the foundation of photography, because without it you wouldn't be able to get a proper exposure. And when we talk about proper exposure, usually what comes to mind is either an image is too dark or too bright. As you can see right now, we're actually working right now with a little bit of mixed lighting. I'm under shade, but my background over here is a little bit overexposed. In order for us to be able to understand this, we have to go ahead and focus on a couple of things. First of all, we have to focus on what each leg of the triangle covers. Now there's three components in the exposure triangle. The first one being aperture, the second one being, of course, shutter speed, and the last one being ISO. Now, aperture measures the amount of light that enters the lens and hits the sensor. It's really a quantitative measurement. Too much light, and the image, of course, is going to be too bright. Too little light, then the image is going to be too dark. Shutter speed actually restricts light. Let me explain. If you have a fast shutter, less light will enter the lens. And if you have a slow shutter, more light will enter the lens as well. Both aperture and shutter speed physically affect the amount of light that will come into the lens. ISO, on the other hand, doesn't affect the light that enters the lens or the amount of time the light is entering the lens, but rather it affects the sensitivity of the image sensor. The higher the sensitivity, though, does come at a cost. The higher the sensitivity, the more digital noise your image is going to have. That's where the exposure triangle comes in, and you start learning the different features of lenses. Start with aperture. I mentioned before that it actually allows more light to come into the lens, and it's actually measured in f-stops. I know that at the very beginning the numbers can be very intimidating and you might not know what they are or what the numbers really mean, but the very first two numbers you have to worry about is going to be 1 and 1.4. If you remember those numbers, then you can actually build your aperture grid real easily. Now let's talk with 1. With 1, all you have to do is just double it. So you have 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. And with 1.4, you also double that, and so you have 1.4, 2.8, 5.6, and then it gets rounded off to f11, f22 that you have with the aperture. When you go from f1 to 1.4, you're actually cutting the amount of light by half. If you go from 1.4 to f2, you again cut the light by half. And if you haven't noticed yet, what happens is that the numbers are actually going larger as the opening is getting smaller. I know it's a little bit backwards, but think of it this way. They're actually fractions. Shutter speed are measured by increments of time. So we start off with the most basic one, 1 second. So if you want to cut the amount of light that goes into your lens by half, then you'll be half a second. Then you'll be, if you want to go even further, then 1/4, then 1/8, 1/16. This is 1/16 of a second. At a certain point though, the numbers switch, so it could be easier to cut down. For example, you go to 1/25, 1/50, 1/100th, 1/200th. The last thing is ISO and how it's measured. Of course, it starts off with ISO 100 and it goes and it increases from there. So you have ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800. If you haven't noticed, I changed the angle. What I'm doing, I'm using actually a longer focal length. And the reason why I'm doing that is so I can show you one of the characteristics of aperture. If you notice that the background is a lot more blurred out. And the reason why that is because I'm actually using a larger aperture that will allow more light to come in. There's a curious thing that happens is that you actually get a more shallow depth of field. F-stop f16, and if you notice, the background is no longer as blurred out as it was with a larger aperture. When you let more light in, not only does the image become brighter, but it also narrows your depth of field. Shutter speed, on the other hand, what it also affects is going to be how fast objects move when you're recording them. Right now I have a slower shutter speed, so if I move my hand, there's going to be some sort of image blur. You start seeing that you actually have to play a balancing game. You affect one thing, you have to actually affect all three in order for you to have the perfect balance, or essentially the perfect exposure. Once more, I tried to maintain the same level of exposure, but this time I went ahead and raised the ISO to a level that may introduce digital noise. I'm hoping that in this video you can actually see the difference between this video in particular and the other ones. I'll put all three up so you can actually see the difference between them. I will once more move my hands, and again, I'm using a faster shutter speed so you can see the way that my hand is captured, and I'll put a still image of that today. I hope that the talk we had about the exposure triangle actually creates a stronger foundation for you. Everybody, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye now.